Welcome to Lecture 2 of the Ecology Unit. So this time we are going to start with big idea number 3. And big idea 3 says living systems store, retrieve, transmit, and respond to information essential to life processes. So we're going to talk about that. First thing though is that I want to make sure that you understand what it's saying. So for instance, retrieve and transmit, that is basically saying communication. And respond has to do with behavior. So, animal behaviors are going to be either 1, innate, which is to say genetic, or 2, they can be learned. And they are learned through interactions with other organisms and the environment. And these behaviors, we can say, are due to natural selection. Natural selection basically selects factors that will increase the likelihood of survival and reproductive fitness of an organism. So, behaviors can be innate or due to instinct. And this is a behavior that's inherited. It's not learned. So, for instance, a bird can fly without ever having been taught once it reaches maturity. And then we have reflexes. Oh my gosh, I can't spell today. So, for instance, the sucking reflex of mammals. A baby will suck whatever is placed against its lips immediately after being born. Then, same thing with a baby, we have a reflex called the Moro reflex. And if you've ever seen it when babies are very young, usually it disappears in the first couple of months. But if you startle a baby, or if you act like you're going to drop a baby type thing, just messing around, they flail their arms. So that is an innate reflex. Then we also have fixed action patterns. And these are innate behaviors that are going to follow a regular unvarying pattern once triggered. So once it is triggered, the behavior has to continue until complete. So for instance, a goose, if a goose sees an egg, it will retrieve the egg with a set of motions and get it back to the nest, even if on the way that egg slips away or is removed somehow from that goose. The goose will continue to do what it's doing, like it's moving an egg, until the task is complete. Another example is the red-bellied stickleback fish. It has a series of behaviors to defend its territory. And this is something that has been mentioned on the AP test before, so the red-bellied stickleback fish. It has this series of behaviors to defend its territory, and it doesn't matter. It could be another fish, it could be a piece of wood, it could be a piece of paper. If that red-bellied stickleback sees another red belly, it starts to defend its territory. And then another one is called imprinting. And it is innate. So this occurs when a behavior is acquired due to an appropriate stimulus that is experienced during what is called a critical period. And it's called a critical period because it's limited time in order to acquire the behavior. But once it is acquired, the behavior is irreversible. So for instance, an example would be goslings. They accept the first moving object as their mother and will follow the object. If nothing moves during that critical period, no imprinting occurs and it never will. So let's talk about how organisms learn. So we've got what is called associative learning, and this is going to occur when an animal learns that two events are connected. So for instance, when the bell rings, you know that it's time to leave class. Pavlov did a famous experiment that taught dogs about the ringing of the bell, and then he fed them. And then after a while, the dogs would begin to salivate even when hearing the bell, even if there was no food. Then there is operant conditioning, and it's a type of associative learning, and it is due to reinforcements and punishments for behavior, whether they be good or bad. Then we have habituation as another type of learning, and it's occurred when an animal has learned to disregard meaningless stimuli. So, for instance, squirrels at parks or on the sidewalk, they're not affected by people, not at all. I remember when I was in San Francisco, I went to a Japanese garden, and there was a little tea place hidden back in there, and there were squirrels, and they would literally climb up onto your table and look at you and wait for you to feed them. So they had no fear of humans at all. Deer grazing along a highway, for instance. Another type of learning is called observational learning. And this is going to occur when one has learned a behavior from another without necessarily having experienced it. And then the final that we're going to talk about is innate learning. And this occurs when an animal performs a new behavior without any experience, and it generates a desirable outcome. Okay, so then we have social behaviors. So we have got what is called a dominant hierarchy, and this is when there's a status relationship in a group. So for instance, male gorillas, they establish a pecking order, and that pecking order establishes who has access to food first. Then we have territoriality. Territoriality. And this is when an animal defends the territory that they inhabit. Another behavior is called agonistic. And this is behaviors that show a threat. So they're going to be baring their teeth, raising their hair, growling, etc. Then we have altruism. And this is a behavior in which one is going to sacrifice themselves for the good of the other. Most of the time, these individuals are usually related. So for instance, prairie dogs. There is a sentinel. Basically, there's a watchdog. And that sentinel is going to sacrifice their survival to warn the others of a predator. And what I mean by sacrifice or survival is, if you think about it, they call out a warning. Their predator now knows where they are. They know where they're located. So they just decreased their fitness or their likelihood of survival. Then you have bees. The female workers will sacrifice themselves by swarming a predator if it threatens the queen bee. And then finally, we have a eusocial society. So this is the group that divides tasks between individuals. So like bees, for instance. One type cares for the young. Another one offers protection. The others forage for food. And they typically have a queen. So eggs are queen to produce the eggs. But so for an example, bees, ants, termites, etc. Then we have cooperative behavior. These tend to increase the fitness of an individual as well as survival of the population. So this is when everyone cooperates together for survival, basically. So you've got herds, flocks, schools of fish. They provide an advantage. Not only can they alert others to the danger, but the high numbers lead to a greater defense. Then we have communication. Organisms can exchange information in response to internal changes and the environmental cues. So this is when organisms use visual, audible, electrical, chemical signals, etc. in order to communicate. It's for different reasons. They can indicate dominance, they could establish territory, they could attract a mate, they could find food, etc. So chemical signals, for instance, this is communication through chemicals that are going to be detected by chemoreceptors. And the chemicals used to communicate are called pheromones. So, for instance, chemoreceptors, we actually have those in our nose. And believe it or not, we actually used to use pheromones in order to attract a mate. This was way, way, way back in the day before we had perfumes and deodorants and everything else. So another example would be plants. They actually can produce chemicals for their protection. So for instance, if a plant has a chewing insect on it, then the plant can actually release the chemical to attract a wasp. And then the wasp ends up laying their eggs on that chewing insect. And then those eggs hatch and they feed on the actual insect. So that is an example of a parasitic relationship, but a mutual relationship between the plant and the wasp. Also, the chewing on the plant causes the plant to express genes and produce that toxin. And it also releases a chemical, and nearby plants will do the same. They will actually produce the same toxin because it's like a big warning to say, hey, there's problems in the area. Plants also produce pheromones to attract pollinators for reproduction purposes. Animals release pheromones in order to mark territory, so I'm sure you've heard of animals peeing on trees, etc. It also helps to attract the opposite sex, and they can detect chemical signals to alert them to predators. And a great example is ants. They actually mark their trails with pheromones so that it can guide them back to the place where they came from, as well as other ants. So if you look at this diagram, this ant went, here's the nest, here's the food. This ant came back this way, and eventually other ants realized, oh, hey, he said, hey, there's food out there. And they kind of followed whatever, went around looking for it, found a scent a little bit. But eventually, this ant will end up having this same trail over and over, and it will continue to do that trail. And once that ant continues to do that trail over and over and over, he's actually leaving those pheromones as that guide, and it gets stronger and stronger. Not saying that these ants are not leaving them, but this one will get stronger and stronger, and eventually all the ants will begin to follow that trail. Then we have visual cues. And this is basically what it says. It's communication through sight. So for instance, in plants, flowers, their color actually will attract specific pollinators. For instance, birds are attracted to red and yellow. Animals, they've got the agonistic behaviors we talked about, baring the teeth, standing here, etc. There's also courtship displays and dances. Then auditory is the communication through the use of sound. So, for instance, an alarm response, sounds to attract the opposite sex. And then there is tactile communication, which is communication through touch. So, for instance, the bee dance, the bees must touch the dancing bee in order to understand location of the food. And then there are things called tree hoppers. They produce vibrations so that other tree hoppers can feel it, and it signals danger. So these behaviors over time have ended up evolving because they actually increase fitness, and they are selected for by natural selection. Animal movement, they move due to stimuli, and there are three common types. There is kinesis, And this is undirected movement. Think of K for crazy, okay? The movement, it's not towards anything, it's not away from anything, it's just all over the place. So for instance, if you think of going outside, lifting a log, and all the bugs scatter, they're just crazy. They don't have a specific destination, they're just trying to get out of there. The next one is taxis, and this movement is either forward, toward it, or away. So this one you could think of taxis. Like if you go somewhere and you get in a taxi, you give that taxi a destination. You are going somewhere, or you are going away from somewhere. And then the last one I'm sure you've heard of is called migration. And this is movement. It's usually a long distance, and it's due to seasonal changes, and it's instinctual. Then finally we have animal rhythms. The first one is called a circadian rhythm. This is also called a biological clock. These are the physiological or behavioral activities aligned with the 24-hour day. So for instance, light is a stimulus and it helps determine our sleep patterns. Animals that are active during the night and sleep during the day, I'm sure you've heard of them. They are called nocturnal animals. There are also animals, obviously, that are active during the day and sleep at night, such as us, well, most of us, and they are called diurnal. And then hibernation. Hibernation is a behavior that's aligned to changes in the season as well. So bears, for instance, it allows them to conserve energy when free energy is not as available. And that is all we have for lecture number 2, short and sweet. See you guys in class.